Hello, Mirin. Nice to
How's
have
it
you on
going?
the podcast. I'm well. I'm very well, extremely well. Really good to have you on the podcast. I've been wanting to have you on there for a while because I've heard about, well, read some of the work you've done, and also especially this book that we're going to discuss. I really want to discuss it with you. Before we get started, can you just explain to our viewers who may not know who you are, what is it you do, and your journey up until this point?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm a sports writer. I'm a senior staff writer at The Ringer. So the work that I do is a lot of long form features, stories that are like 4,000-ish words. Not limited to basketball, but basketball is my first love. I played all my life, played a year in college. But I also do football. I do random track stories. I just want to find what's interesting. And so whatever I can tell that shows the human interest side of a sports story, that's what I consider my beat. So yeah, I wanted to go to the WNBA growing up. That was my dream. Worked for that for like 10 years. Happened to be 5 feet tall. It didn't happen. But I knew that I had to stay in basketball somehow. So I was like, okay, maybe sports journalism will work for me. And that's when I got into the writing and started my career at a newspaper, Orange County Register, for 4 years out here in Los Angeles, where I'm from and where I live now. And then I went to Bleacher Report, and then The Ringer. So yeah, that's sort of a short summary of my journey.
Cool, cool. Now we're here today because I wanted to talk about your latest book, which is biography of Hakeem Olajuwon. Um, First of all, why did you decide to write about him? Bearing in mind, I think he had an autobiography out in the 90s. So
Yeah,
why did you decide to
94.
write another? Yeah. So why did you decide to write another book about him? Why did
Because that book was in 94, I just felt like there was a generation of fans, people under 30, that sadly don't know who he is and his impact. And that impact goes so far beyond basketball. You know, what he did was incredible on the court, but what he stood for, who he was, that is so compelling and interesting and important to know. He's a great role model. And I just thought this younger generation always seems to leave him out when we're talking about these, clickbait discussions of who's the best all time. And you just never hear his name. And it's sad because, in my opinion, I felt he's just one of the most underrated athletes of our time. And you put together what he stood for, how he embraced Islam, and, the things that made him such a humble, um, gracious person. I just felt like the story needed to be told, to show his impact on so many different people. The Giannis book was about Giannis and his life story, but it was also kind of like a summary of this current landscape where international players dominate the league, and specifically African players. And I just kind of thought, well, who's the pioneer that paved the way for Giannis, for Joel Embiid? Who is that first African superstar that doesn't really get the credit? And I was like, okay, it's Dream. Like, I've got to do something on Dream. So I almost think of this book like the prequel to the other book.
Okay, okay. So start back at the beginning. Obviously, he born and grew up in Nigeria. What was his childhood like? What, did he always want to be a basketball player, or did he want to go into some other profession?
Yeah, basketball was not on his mind at all. In fact, one of the best parts about reporting for this book was getting to talk with his coaches from Lagos who are in their 80s now. And they were talking about how they would just go up to him because he was the tallest person in his neighborhood, just this lanky beanpole. And they were like, please play basketball. And he was like, no, I have no interest. And so they practically stalked him for like months saying, can you please give basketball a try? And he just had no interest. He was a handball player. Handball was a really big sport at the time there. Handball is not what you all think about PE, just throwing the ball. It is intense. It
Mm.
requires quickness, court vision, all of that. He was a great football player. The speed and the quickness again and the agility, he learned that in football. But really, was an afterthought. For him, it was all about education. The goal was to study abroad, get his college degree, and get a good job. That's what all his siblings did. He came from a really well-educated family that talked about the importance of always putting your studies first. Sports was like, what are you doing? You're wasting time. Do something serious with your life. And, a lot of people didn't understand that he came from, a really middle-class upbringing, a very happy childhood. I really wanted to show that he was from a vibrant community. It wasn't just, that Legos and the food and the culture and the fashion. There was one of the biggest music festivals that was right in his neighborhood. The artist Fela lived a couple doors down. Like it was just such a vibrant time. And he grew up around all of this, which was really cool to look into because really nothing was kind of known about his upbringing. I searched and searched and I was like, why has nobody talked about this? But it was really important to get to his roots.
So, what made him decide to try his hand at basketball? What turned him?
I think it was just the coaches were being relentless and it kind of paid off the persistence. The other part was he was really severely bullied for his height, and it was a source of shame at the beginning. He would slouch in doorways, but basketball kind of gave him a chance to take that height and feel differently about it. You could be powerful on the court. You didn't have to hide. You didn't have his height was almost seen as like this gift that nobody else had. So it was like the first time people were talking about his height in a positive way. And when he tries it out, he falls in love with it instantly. It's awesome because his nickname is the Dream, and you would think, okay, he's a natural, he's amazing. He was not good at basketball at first. So although he definitely made the switch and was like, okay, I'm going to try this out, he still played handball. In fact, he was toggling back and forth between handball competitions and basketball competitions because he still loved the other sport and he wasn't that good at basketball, but it took him a long time to like fully dedicate himself to basketball.
You say he wasn't great at basketball initially, but from reading the book, he seemed to have that even that young age, that drive, that determination, that
Yes.
power to carry on. Would that be a fair comment to make?
Yes, absolutely. That drive that you're talking about that he had, you just can't teach that. Like either you are a competitor and you just feel this burning in you to out hustle your competitors, and or you don't. And he had that. What he lacked in skill, he made up for with that passion. He would stay after. A lot of the block, he was a great defensive player. A lot of the blocks that he got early on was just sheer determination. Like, I will not let you score on me. And that work ethic, that commitment is how he got better. I think that is such a thread of his entire basketball career as he'd continue on, is just like, okay, the natural talent wasn't there, but the drive and the willingness to look within himself and push himself to be better is really what separated him from his peers.
So that drive obviously improved him as a player. How did he get from? Because obviously back then the NBA didn't have that many international players, if any. So how did he go from that to ended up going to America? Was it his studies that brought him to America initially, or was it something more?
Yeah, this was actually the most interesting parts of the reporting for me because prior to doing this book, all I really knew, and I think what most people knew, was this like 1 to 2 sentence narrative of how this all happened, which was he was in Legos and somehow this white American coach happened to be coaching there. He saw him, he thought he was so good, brings him to America. He's supposed to go to St. John's. It's actually so cold. He doesn't want to go there as a result. So he just randomly picks University of Houston and then he turns into a star and then the school ends up going to the Final Four, and like what a dream story. But it's actually far more complicated than that and not exactly true the way it's been mythologized over the couple decades. Really, what happened and what I discovered from what happened is that this coach, Chris Pond, who was coaching the Central African Republic, he did scout him, but over the years, he kind of posited himself as like working for the State Department. And I found that he actually didn't. It doesn't mean he wasn't a contractor or did freelance, but he was not like an actual State Department official as it was discussed over the last couple of decades. And St. John's didn't recruit Olajuwon either. So Chris Pond, I think, wanting to be sort of this international recruiter, we didn't really have those in that era, late 70s, early 80s. He kind of maybe was overcompensating and saying, "Oh, I can get you to St. John's, I can get you here, I can get you there." And for me interviewing the St. John's coaches and them saying, "Actually, we never recruited Olajuwon, we never had plans for his visit," just kind of busted that myth about how he got here. And really what happened is he was supposed to go to Houston. He had a plan, he had a ticket. He just went a little bit earlier than he was supposed to. but he had to make the team like everybody else. He wasn't even enrolled in school. It was this really weird in between period where people knew that University of Houston had this like really, really tall new freshman recruit, but he wasn't really in school and he was still getting his grades together and he was trying to make the team. And so it was sort of this weird thing that nobody decided to interrogate or talk about. But of course, because of all the intangible qualities we talked about, from work ethic to drive to natural athleticism, when he does get on the court, he does well enough, especially on the defensive end, that he earns a spot on the team.
What did his family think about the move to America and especially to play in a university basketball team?
Yeah, so basketball back then, there wasn't this idea of like, yeah, you can play sports in college or you can play sports professionally. That just was not a conception. And they were very much against him playing sports at first, because they felt it would interfere with his studies. Getting your education was everything. And given that, his siblings were really highly educated and traveled, the goal was always for him to get his education abroad. Um, Texas in particular, a lot of Nigerians did immigrate in the 70s to Texas in particular, among other places. So it was not unheard of to go there. But his parents were so emotional at the airport. That to me, that scene in the book where he's leaving and everybody's crying at the airport because you don't really know what your son is off to. This random coach says, "Hey, your son is really good. I'm going to take him to America to play basketball." It just doesn't make sense. Of course, his family knew about basketball in the NBA once Hakeem also started explaining it to them, but they were not thrilled about it. It wasn't honestly until um, later in his college years, and I would say his first 2 years in the NBA, where his family like fully embraced what he was doing and said, "Okay, I get it. You are making a respectable living and lifestyle choices by playing sports in America."
Up to this point in the story, how long had he actually been playing basketball? Because he seems to have been not playing it for about what, 3 years, 3, 4 years?
Yeah, so he started in 1979. So when he gets to the university, he has not been playing for, more than a year. Um, yeah, it's only been, I would say, yeah, when they made the Final Four his junior year, his last year, that, yeah, he had only played for about 3 years, which is crazy. I don't think people realize how crazy that is. I'm glad you pointed that out.
Well, especially coming from a background where basketball isn't the main sport at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Football is everything. Basketball is like, what is that? It was just emerging. And like, yes, they had amazing players in Legos. In fact, a lot of the people that were in the army were their best basketball players. So Hakeem not only had competition that was like, older than him, but these men were like physical. They were military trained. But yeah, basketball was like a secondary sport.
Yeah, and yeah, he's okay with all the intangibles you mentioned. He just seems to have started doing really well, which leads me on to both when he started at university team and also what Houston. How did he cope with the team, for example, and their teammates, and also the city of Houston in general?
Yeah. His teammates were really supportive, which was really nice to see because I know they are all still friends to this day. But they challenged him. They were like, "What is this skinny guy doing? Like, does he even know how to play?" And so they definitely, they pushed him and that developed a bond. But really, for Hakeem, it wasn't culture shock coming to America because he grew up in such a cosmopolitan city in Lagos. So people wrongly assumed that this would be such a culture shock. They didn't even realize that English was the official language of Nigeria. So there was a lot of misconceptions and ignorance and racism that he dealt with. But as far as Houston itself, it's such a rich history of culture and a vibrant community in the third ward, and he really talked very deeply with his teammates about what it means to come from Africa, and his team was majority Black, and so there was a lot of interesting conversations happening about their own respective experiences. Particular one teammate that grew up in Chicago, and they were talking about Chicago versus Lagos and what that meant. So I think his teammates really helped him, not, I wouldn't say adjust, but just be there for him and have these deep conversations because Hakeem was pretty homesick at first.
You say that his teammates were supportive, but going by what I read, the media seemed very ignorant of where he came from, even to the point where they actually mispronounced his name. How long
Right.
did that go on for, and how long before he actually started earning the respect of the media?
Yeah, thank God that newspaper archives are still alive because reading those articles, you almost were like, is this parody? Like this can't actually have been. And you're like, oh yeah, of course it is. It's 1980 Texas. Like, what are we talking about? Like, of course. But reading it is just so jarring. Like the most ignorant, the most racist, all the awful tropes thinking he came from poverty war torn country, like it was just so blatant, it was so in your face. And talking with a lot of those reporters nowadays, it's interesting, they were able to see like, oh yeah, like the way that he was characterized was really awful. And it continued on through the prose, and that's one part of his story that people never talk about. They just talk about the glory years of his team in college, as well as, those early Rockets teams that almost beat the Celtics and the Lakers in their heyday. But there were so many articles that mispronounced his name, um, mocked where he came from, belittled just his culture. Um, and it's unfortunate. And it took him a decade to say, "Hey, this is my name."
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, the ignorance is, and to me, it shows how poor journalists they were, because a journalist's true nature should be to be investigative and
Right.
actually search and ask questions, but they just seemed lazy with those
Yeah.
chats. I know it's a different time, but it's just the laziness more than anything.
was
Yeah,
so it was so oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
no, no, it's okay. Carry on. I was gonna say it's just so lazy. It's just even then you shake your head.
I know it was lazy and it was also just bad writing.
Mm.
To me, I'm like, Look at this like fantastic, like kind young man that's in front of you that seems like full of life and is like really excited to be there." And the writing was just flat. It was flat. It was uncurious. It was you could just tell they thought they were so clever. Like there was one line where a writer was like, he swats shots, like blocks shots, like he does flies in his native country. Um, Disgusting, right? But you could just tell the writer was like just sitting there like, that is, look how clever I am. Like they were trying to be doing like rhyme within the sentences, and I was just like, this is so bad. Um, yeah, it's lazy. I also think it's so weird that nobody bothered to investigate how he even got there. Like that to me, the fact that it's been what, like 4 decades, and this book is the first to really say, who is Chris Pond? How did this all happen? Did he really go to St. John's? I just think it was really weird that nobody tried to investigate that at the time. And, a lot of the journalists being interviewed now by me in this stage, they basically said everyone sort of liked that there was a myth about him. They really liked that there was mystery. Nobody really, they just ate it up. Like, wow, this guy quote came from nowhere. Like they liked that narrative rather than, doing their job of investigating it.
See, to me, that seems bizarre because, and we'll get into his later career later on in the interview, but especially when he became like MVP and whatnot, did no one think, okay, we want more interviews with this person, we want to know where this person
Right.
comes from? It just seems, oh, he just came from nowhere and we like the myth. That just
Right.
seems bizarre to me, to be honest.
Unintelligent, bizarre, lazy, every word you can think of. It's sad because, like, think of all the stories that could have been told during his actual career, right? It's 2024 now, but think if these stories were out in the 90s.
Yeah, indeed. And sadly, they weren't. And sadly, he coped with that. Although, what I found interesting, especially with his name, mispronunciation of his name, he didn't correct the media. Why
Yeah.
was that? Was it just because he was shy, or what was his reasons for not doing that?
That seems to be the reason that a lot of his teammates think to this day is that, he's just such a polite person that is just, taught to respect your elders and like you don't want to correct them. And but what was interesting was interviewing a journalist. She was like one of the first, Tracy Dodd. She was one of the first to interview him during that year where he wasn't quite on the team, but you would see him on the bench and people were like, who's this recruit that seems to have joined their team? and he signed his name on her notebook as Hakeem with an H.
Okay.
So it was clear they were all mispronouncing his name, but it was wrong. It was with an H. So, people think, oh, he changed his name later. He didn't change his name. It was just mispronounced and he didn't correct it. Um, I discovered that it was a secretary's error. Like she essentially, like, because when you say it, sometimes the H sounds silent. And so they wrote Akeem, but it really was Hakeem.
Okay. So how was the University of Houston's basketball team like while he was there? What success or non-success did they have?
They were the coolest, funnest. I know funnest is not a word, but they were the coolest, funnest team ever. I just would sit for hours and watch old YouTube clips of their team, which was nicknamed Phi Slamma Jamma. Like they would dunk on you, they would embarrass you, they would run past you, just the flash, the fun. Like this is one of the most cool moments in basketball history. This team was incredible, and sadly, they never won a national championship. They kept getting close and close and close, and they just never won it. But the uniforms they had these like satin jerseys and like satin warm-ups. Like they were oozing cool. It was like when people think of Fab Five, they don't even realize like this precursor to that. Phi Slamma Jamma was it. And so yeah, they were amazing. Like Clyde Drexler would like jump over people and dunk on them. So Hakeem, he really fit in with this team because he didn't have to be an offensive superstar. He could just get a dunk. They were just a fast breaking team. He didn't yet have those like arsenal of post moves that he would have in the pros, but he played amazing defense, solidified his reputation as like one of the top shot blockers in the country. And he was like the perfect addition to that team.
Yeah. One of the things that's a theme, certainly from this point in the story throughout the rest of the book, is his religion, because he's Muslim, and correct me if I'm wrong, he was brought up Muslim and then came to America. And didn't he say that he kind of lost his way with that a little bit, and then that developed? He got back to it while his career was going on, and even now he's like still very strong in his faith. Why did he? Was it because of the homesickness? Why that he had that period where he almost not forgot to play is the wrong term, but almost lost his way when it came to religion?
Yeah, essentially that's all true. It's very accurate. It was part of the homesickness. It was also like that teammate Eric Davis, who I mentioned was from Chicago. They did talk about religion. They did talk about Islam and the values, but Hakeem admitted that he wasn't really observant anymore. And I think part of it, one of the so Hakeem owns and has like built up a mosque currently in Houston right now, and the director of that mosque, who he kind of explained to me that the thinking is like when you're immigrating to a place, everything is new. There's so much going on. He was adjusting to basketball, school, all these things. He was without his family for the first time, and it just sort of went by the wayside. He was living the college life. They partied, they did drink, of course, like any college student, and religion just kind of faded to the background. And it wasn't until, a 10-year period to the late 80s when he realized that something was missing in his life. And it wasn't immediately clear that it was his religion, because it meant a lot to him growing up. The way he describes hearing the call is so beautiful. And like how hearing that just brought back so many memories of like praying with his family, and his parents were so religious and they made the Hajj and all this stuff. Um, and so he returns to religion. I think a lot of people wrongly say he converted to Islam, but he never converted. He grew up with it. He was raised in it. He just abandoned it for a decade and then came back to it.
Right. So he's had his college career doing well, well to the point that he's actually is it first pick in the draft
Yeah.
ahead
Over
of
Michael Jordan.
Michael
Yeah.
Jordan. Yeah, exactly. Which I read that and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's bizarre. So
And nobody is like, hey, they should have taken Jordan. Like, you don't hear anybody saying that to this day.
yeah, yeah, which I think is is really bizarre. But from what I understand, because obviously we have something different like with sports here in terms of transfers and whatnot, whereas I know as far as
Okay.
draft. But I know there's certain negotiations go on so you can change who you pick and whatnot. But was it always destined for him to go to Houston, or were there other teams that actually really wanted him?
Yeah, definitely other teams wanted him. Back then, the NBA system was so different. Like, I honestly, in the editing of this book, I chopped so much on this because I really wanted to go in about like how this draft would change how prospects are drafted because they had to flip an actual coin, which sounds so funny now, imagining these two GMs just like flipping a coin and like figuring out who will come to them. So different from the lottery system that we have. But the rumor was the Rockets were tanking so that they could get back to back number one picks so they could get Hakeem and this other guy, Ralph Sampson, who was 7'4". So you could have two very tall centers. But the Bulls really were enamored by Hakeem, and talking with both the former Bulls GM and assistant coach who scouted him, it was so interesting to see how like if they would have got the number one pick, they said they would have drafted Hakeem for sure. So it's interesting to think about the what ifs. You know, what if Hakeem went to the Bulls? What if he and Jordan actually teamed up? Or Jordan and Ralph Sam, like there's a million combinations. And the Trailblazers were like in the mix and they ended up picking Sam Bowie, the injured player. And anyways, kind of one of the most fascinating drafts. Hakeem does go number one. He's the unanimous pick. There's no question about it. Jordan was obviously great in college, but as you see in the quotes in the book, the Bulls people were like not even 100% sure. They're like, yeah, he's good, but like, can you win with a guard? You know, back then it was like you had to pick a center. It's so different from the way it is now. And so they knew he was good, but they didn't know he was like Michael Jordan GOAT status good. So
Yeah.
they went with Hakeem, which I think is so funny.
Yeah, I mean, both of them actually done very well with their careers, but yeah, I mean, the way that was chosen. And you're saying that the draft, from that draft moment, they actually changed the way they do the draft, and if so, how did they change it?
Yeah, it turned into a lottery system because while I can't prove that the Rockets tanked to get Hakeem, like I can't literally prove that players intentionally threw games so they could get the high draft pick. There was this kind of sense among teams that like this people are doing this and the coin flip it's not the way to go. We need to stop having this incentive of teams, you know, tanking to get the number one draft pick again and again. So after this draft, they change it to the lottery system, and it's I truly believe it's because of what happened with this with Hakeem and Jordan and the players in this draft.
So, how did he get on with the Rockets in his first couple of years as a pro?
Yeah, he was magnificent. And it honestly it blew the Rockets away because they knew they were having a defensive specialist, but they didn't know they were going to get, you know, a double-double machine like an offensive star. They were hoping the offense would develop, but they didn't think it would develop that quickly. And I think a lot of that credit goes to this assistant coach at the time, Carol Dawson, who actually just died a couple days ago, really sad. He was one of the best interviews in the book, but he and Hakeem would just work on their drop steps every single day, and he started learning jab fakes and all these things, and he just became so polished offensively. And so Hakeem just goes through the league as I think Dominique Wilkins told me like a freight train or something like that. There was a quote like that. Um, and he takes the young Rockets all the way to the NBA Finals in '86 versus the Celtics. And they lost, but it was such a big moment for Hakeem. Like, okay, this is the future because you know he was going against Robert Parrish, who was incredibly complimentary of him for this book. He went against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and it was so clear to all these you know aging centers that Dream was the future of the position. He moved the way that the NBA centers at the time did not. He was mobile, he was quick, he was flashy. I mean, it was just so different. So he did really well. And but the problem was he would get ejected from games because he was such a competitor, a fiery competitor, and he would get a lot of technicals early on. People don't realize that.
Was that something that happened to him throughout his career, or actually going back to the religion? Was that something where he kept the fire within him, but it helped calm him down a little bit?
Yeah, exactly that. It's interesting because you could see it in college, which people also don't realize. There was that one fight with that UCSB player, who I actually tracked down an interview. That was really fun. He got punched by a Olajuwon punch. Olajuwon apologized years later, which is really sweet. When they were both adults and pros. But yes, religion it just gave him a different discipline. It gave him a way to handle when people would foul him, because a lot of the temper was not him being the instigator. People would foul the crap out of him. Like, I got people on record saying all we could do to stop him, because we couldn't stop him, was to foul him. And so it would cause him to react in these ways that were obviously not conducive to the team's success, because he'd get ejected. But once he like really became super devout with his religion again, there was just a calmness. Temperamentally, he was just different. Instead of getting angry at people for fouling him, he would say that he would pray to God for them. Like, it was like a different person almost. Not different, but just much better. Like anyone, he just kind of grew up. I think that's what it was too. We forget how young he was when he came to college in a new country. And I think he just sort of kept maturing and ultimately just realized, like, hey, I don't need to fight these people.
Well, not just how young he was, but how quick this happened, because all this was happening
Right.
within like 5 years, if that's correct.
Yeah, and think about it, that he picked up basketball, like, in a couple months and then was on a plane to America. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, you just started playing, now they're telling you you can go play in America, and you're like, "For what? Like, do I go I don't understand, I just wanna get my degree, I wanna make my parents proud." Like, it's just a lot happened very quickly.
Yeah, that seems, especially in like the best league in the world in that particular sport, to do
Right.
that seems very, yeah, very, very weird. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, very weird at all. What year did was he first picked for the All-Star game?
I believe that was his rookie year. He came off the bench because he was a little miffed that, so that must have been 84, 85. Yeah, it was 85 because he was drafted in 84, I believe, and the season was 84 to 85. So I think 85. Um, and he was a little miffed that he wasn't getting much playing time. And Ralph Sampson was like, "Young fella, it's gonna be okay. Like, just earn your keep. You'll be fine."
So in the 5 year span we've talked about so far, started playing basketball, he's then gone to America, played for Houston, he's then become the number one draft pick for Houston, and then he becomes gets in the All-Star team. And I know he missed out on the Rookie of the Year to Jordan. Is that correct?
Right. Yep.
Yeah,
Runner up.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I talked about it briefly earlier. When did he first become MVP?
There were a couple years where he was like leading the league in rebounds, blocks, one of the top 5 in scoring, I think, but he still wasn't named MVP, but he was like on the list. He would get votes. So that was like late 80s, early 90s, but he did not, I think he got his first MVP that first championship year in 94. Yeah, I believe that's what happened. Regular season MVP and finals MVP in 94.
Gosh, yeah. And it's interesting because obviously, in a way, he was obviously people knew about him and respected him, but especially those early years. I know he got to the NBA Finals, but then Michael Jordan really starts taking off. He had Dennis Rodman, got people in the whole Chicago
Right.
Bulls, that dynasty, and then Jordan retires, and then it's his time with Houston. And
Yeah.
what's interesting is because I played basketball myself, and then but I watched a lot of it on TV back then. We were back in the UK, and I remember with Houston, I didn't realize how tight some of the games were.
Right.
Yeah, that was some of the series were like one game. I'm like, oh, okay, I don't remember this. I knew they won, but I didn't
Right.
realize it so tight. I mean, was that the first time they'd actually won the NBA Finals, Houston?
Yeah, it was, and definitely not only were the games tight, they were so low scoring, and people were like, "This is ugly basketball. Like, this is not entertaining at all." But it was because they were the Knicks and the Rockets were these two defensive juggernauts, and so, it was not the prettiest game, but it definitely was like it could have gone to anyone, like pound for pound. They were just going at each other. And Houston as a city had struggled so much with all its sports teams, right? Like, forget basketball. Like, this was the first major championship for any sports team in the modern era. So it was a huge, huge deal. Like, people in Houston described to me feeling like pride, because there's always this sense in Houston that, people don't respect you. They don't respect your teams. They think you always fall short. You come close like they did in college with those Final Fours, but you always end up losing. And this first championship was really seen as like a collective communal breakthrough. Like, hey, we are on top. Like, Houston is a champion, which is a new feeling.
So it was the Knicks have fought in one finals, and who was it in the second? Was it San Antonio? Is that correct? Or
The second one was in 95 was actually against the Magic, but they played the San Antonio Spurs on the way. I think that
okay,
was Western Conference Finals with that crazy series with David Robinson where he just embarrassed him so much. And David Robinson is so good. Like that's the thing that I want people to take away from this. Do not think that David Robinson was bad. He's an amazing defender. It's just that just shows you how amazing Hakeem was. He just made the greatest in the game look so silly.
yeah. Well, Shaquille O'Neal even said that that was his hardest
Yes.
opponent was Hakeem.
Yes, yes. Shaq was one of my favorite interviews for the book. Like he was like, no question, Hakeem is ranked above me all time. He was like, he's the only one I couldn't intimidate. I just love the reverence that he and so many of the former NBA players I spoke to have for Hakeem. Like when they speak of him, it's almost in this like I don't know, like regal. Like they it's just like Hakeem is like this otherworldly, like the respect they have for him is so palpable.
Yeah, you can tell that. And again, going back to his religion, that had an
Yeah.
influence in terms of the sponsorship deals that he had, and also well, what the state, well, not so much the status, but basically the memorials are put up for him. So, for instance, they want to do a statue of him. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Right.
Houston, but he would allow that because of his religion. Is that correct?
Exactly. So because of his religion, he can't do anything that goes anywhere near close to idolatry. So a lot of these statues, they usually have a bust of your head, which is it can be seen as idolatry and worshiping, a person other than Allah or a being other than Allah. So he was like, no, I cannot have that, and he had to have a bust of just his jersey. Can't wear men can't wear gold, so he had his ring, his championship ring, made with a different kind of platinum. Can't drink alcohol. So in the championship celebrations, there's this powerful scene at the end of the book where he's literally draining expensive champagne down the drain because he literally cannot, not only can he not drink it, he can't give it to somebody else. So his teammates were like, Dream, pass the drink. And he was like, no, I can't, I literally cannot give it to you.
Yeah.
It's against my religion. So that was, it's one thing to say I care about my religion. It's another thing to just like embody every principle. And he was so principled. He was even late to the championship parade, I discovered, because he was at the mosque he could not miss his Friday prayer.
Yeah. Wasn't there a sneaker deal he did which wasn't as expensive as Nike, but he did it anyway because he went to the shop to see how they were made, and you made out that
Yes.
top up was a lot. And obviously because of his religion and usury, he couldn't accept that. So he went down to someone where the price between making it and selling it was actually fairly close.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Thanks for bringing that up. He essentially saw that the way that these sneakers at the time, which were getting pretty huge, it was the first time that like with Jordans, players had signature shoes. They were ripping off profits. Not only like families couldn't afford them, but the process with which it was made was just unethical in so many ways. People were working in sweatshops, and he literally went and saw that the middlemen who were making these products were being cheated. And so he's like, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make an affordable shoe that is $30. And it was not popular. People definitely mocked it. But I wanted to include that to show Hakeem's legacy is really not just about what he did on the court, but he was different in every sense of the word. And people don't talk about the way that he was really otherized in terms of marketing. Like we talk about he's underrated these days in 2024. You never hear his name among the all-time greats. But even while he was playing, there were so many racist things written about him that he was unmarketable because he was a foreigner, as they say, that this foreigner, quote, quote, could not be, quote, palatable to American audiences. And they would just use these, dog whistles again and again and again to otherize him. And he was just like, F it, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to make affordable sneakers. They might not be popular, but I got to be true to myself.
Even okay, I know going this about a lot of his religion, but there's even a case where he's having arterial fibrillation as
Oh, yeah.
going to the airport, and he wouldn't go on the plane because he had to pray, and they found a room for him to pray. So
Yes, and the PR man, who's now the head of PR for the NBA, Tim Frank, was like try Hakeem and him were at the airport trying to desperately, get on a plane to go to the hospital to get him treated after this road game. And Hakeem was like, I can't, like, I have to pray. And Tim was like, what do you mean? We got to get on the plane. He's like, I have to pray. And so they found him a room. Um, by exchanging autographs. He signed a few things and then they got a private room and he prayed. And it was just such a moving example of like, no matter what you're going through, even if potential heart issues and very scary things, you just cannot miss the 5 times a day that you're supposed to pray.
yeah, so we're coming to the end of his career, and it seems to be winding down. And it seems to be that he's getting to the end, but almost can't quite accept the end. Would that be a
Yeah.
fair comment to make?
Yeah, and it's sad because you feel for him, right? Like the shake just wasn't shaking. Like the body just breaks down, especially God, all the battles that he went through. I can't imagine how his body endured that for 20 years. And he was just kind of a shell of himself and he just couldn't stay healthy. There were different injuries and he even had a breathing thing. Anemia, just a lot of different things cascading. And finally, he ends up his final year in Toronto, which to this day feels so wrong. Like when you see him in purple, you're like, this is just not right.
Yeah. Seems weird, yeah, because he had to adapt to being in Houston, what, 17 years, and he went up to not just a new city, but a new country as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which is, I guess, the story of his life, right?
Yeah, indeed. But he was only there for what, a couple of years.
He was
Uh,
there for 1 year. Yeah, one
oh,
season.
okay, yeah, and then obviously I think they got to the playoffs, but I think knocked out in the first round. And at that stage, he said, "Well, you need an operation," but at that point, he said, "I'll just retire." That
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct, and it's interesting because, the move to Toronto coincided with 9/11, and that was so important for me to get into of what he meant to so many different people within the Toronto Muslim community and how he did all these things behind the scenes of, like, helping mosques raise money or being there for university students that were denied prayer rooms, and just he was such a focal member of that community, and that's something that is just never talked about because it's like, "Oh, he went to Toronto, they sucked as a team, his career ended," but it's like, actually, that final chapter was so meaningful outside of basketball.
Yeah, indeed. And since then, he's been traveling around the world. Although he's settled in, I think, back in Houston now, but
Yeah.
initially when he started, he was set about the world. I think he lived in Jordan for a while.
Mhm.
And one of the interesting things about Hakeem and I mean, how I know about him, not just through playing basketball, was he actually spent a few years living in my hometown of Birmingham, England.
Oh, okay, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. So why did he go to Birmingham, England? Because it just seems a random place to actually stay.
His daughter was in university near
Oh,
there.
okay.
And so he got to know he was in Birmingham for a while and he was very involved in the Birmingham Basketball Club. I think that's what it's called. He held so many camps there. And of course he got to know the Muslim community within that town as well. And yeah, he's been everywhere. That's the thing about him is like when you talk to people that live in Amman, they're like, we love Hakeem. We talk to
Mm.
people in the UK, we love Hakeem. It's like he's just worldwide.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And actually, we talked earlier about him being the first big foreign player in the NBA. That's had a massive influence because I know in the NFL they have is an international player pathway. They seem to be having something similar, albeit possibly done a different way in NBA, and that, in a way, is solely down to his success.
Exactly. I really wanted that to be such a big theme of the book that everything we see now, it's really goes back to him and the way that he paved the way. Um, we talked so much about how, his arrival to America was so like confusing and weird and by accident almost he gets to America. But because of his success and the way that he inspired other African players, there's now a pathway for a person with his skill set coming up today to be in camps. There's actual academies all over the continent, and there's so many ways for a young African player to get noticed, get scouted, not even for the NBA, but just for college hoops around the world. And NBA Africa and the academies they started and the history there, like that's such a big part of the book because I think Hakeem doesn't get credit enough for that. Shirley Dikembe Mutombo, who unfortunately passed a couple days ago, he really was huge in those efforts of establishing NBA Africa and these new pathways for success. So I just thought that was such an important part of the book.
What would you like Hakeem's legacy to be?
That's a great question. What would I like his legacy to be? His legacy is you can give to others and you can be humble and still be massively successful. I think that we think that you have to be very selfish and you have to be very individualistic to achieve things.
Mhm.
And his whole career has proved that you can be a master at your craft without centering yourself, without having an ego that is out of control. Um, you can do the work behind the scenes to inspire others and make an impact without having to constantly market yourself. You don't see him on TV these days with his counterparts like Kenny Smith, Shaq, Charles Barkley. He just does the work behind the scenes. And I think the legacy is just how can you help other people, right? Like that
Mhm.
to this day, the fact that he's working out with Giannis, like that's amazing. So I think the legacy is really community and giving to others.
Yeah, because you gave to others with helped a lot of future players as well, likes of Kobe Bryant and LeBron
Right.
James. And so in a way, that's it, as much as his legacy as what he did on the actual court as well.
Exactly, exactly, like, and just the way that his mentors helped him, he has now shaped the next generation and helped them, so it's this constant theme, and that's why I ended the book the way I did of, like, it's all connected, it's all related, like, this idea of helping others as just like in the next generation, it's just like as, the president of, who started the Basketball Africa League was like, that is a fundamental African concept of you help the person that is coming after you, and the person before you helps you, and it just continues to rise. And so I just think that like he embodies that 100%.
Oh, cool. For those who are wondering why it's dark at my end, it's actually winter and the sun's going down. So if
Everyone's
wondering, people can't
wondering why
understand.
mine is excessively bright. It's because California is gonna burn to death.
Just give me one moment. Hang on.
Okay.
Right, so that's a bigger comedy moment there, right? So, right. So, just quickly, a couple of questions just about yourself and your career.
Okay.
So, in regards to this book, really good read. Hope it really does well. If, in terms of your own work, what are you looking to do now in terms of book wise? Have you thought of an idea yet? Have you not? Or
Yeah, I am on to book 3. I am thinking, I am brainstorming. I'm really excited about that. Um, as you noticed probably reading, there's a lot of people I interviewed that passed away after I interviewed them, and it's really kinda given me an urgency to try to capture, these interviews and talk to these legends before they leave us, and so I think that is an inspiration for my next book of, like, really trying to get this testimony before it's too late. At the same time, like, I love the stories that I get to do for The Ringer, and it allows me to, like, as much as I love basketball, it allows me to step outside of basketball and do other things too. So, like right now I'm working on a football story. So I just want to tell stories that gives people a sense of like who somebody is off the floor. Like I just personally find that much more interesting than like stats or numbers and stuff.
oh, cool. If people want to find your work, where can they go to?
Yes, I am on X as well as Instagram at Mirin Fader, Mirinfader. Um, I am going on tour for the first time in my life, which is so
Okay,
crazy. I
cool.
get a multiple thank you, I get a multiple cities to promote the book, so I hope, if you're in the US, like, people show up. Um, I do know that I'm doing a signed, book thing with Brazos Bookstore in Houston, and they do ship internationally, so if you go to my social media, you see the link for Brazos Bookstore, it can ship anywhere, for a signed copy, so
Oh, cool. I will leave details in the description below this interview. But Mirin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. All the very best with the book, and thank you so much for coming on to the 286 project.
thank you, that was so fun. Appreciate it.
Yeah.